Wait. There was a button in the top right that says go live, and I just hadn't clicked that. So I think it's live now. Try it again.
It might take like 20 seconds.
New UIs, man.
Who does that? Who updates their UI on their users and like?
Who does that?
Because it'll be better.
Who needs new features?
Okay.
I see it live.
You see it now? Okay. Sorry. We finally did it. Thank you for your patience. Take it away, Will.
All right. Welcome everyone to our last meetup of the year. It's not the last day of the year, but it's the last meetup of 2020. It's been a crazy, tumultuous year, and we're glad to all still be here with each other. Advance the slide. We've done our best to stay safe. We went remote with this in March, and that was like, I remember that was crazy, just like realizing the adjustments we needed to make. But we're grateful to be here. I will say one thing. I've had as rough a year as anyone. Fortunately, nothing too crazy within my immediate family, but I'm very thankful for this community. I'm thankful for the connections I've gotten to make here. It's been very supportive and very helpful to me personally. And I would encourage you all, whether you are here for your first meetup or if you've been around for years, keep making those connections, keep making friends here, keep meeting people, and keep helping each other. We will have just a light social chat after the talks today, and just hang out and just get to know each other. Our sponsors, Zoom, helped us out big time this year with, the funny thing was they jumped up to sponsor us before all this happened, and before we were expecting to need it like we do now. So they've been fantastic. SALT supports our meetup fees, and Turing, we can't wait to get back to Turing and meet down in the basement on Market Street again for our next in-person meetup sometime later in 2021. As always, thank you to everyone at Open Collective. We host all of our finances on Open Collective. You can donate there. We have some amazing people that have donated their own money personally and contributed and sponsored this meetup. Love to hear if anyone's hiring or if anyone's looking. You can post in the meetup page. You can post in the Zoom chat. You can do both, but please post in one of those two places if you're hiring with contact info, and if you're looking with whatever contact info you feel comfortable with. It could be your LinkedIn page or a link to your website or your Twitter handle, whatever is good for you. Please post that. Are there any announcements? And please either speak up and throw something in the chat, or speak up on the mic if you feel comfortable. Cool. All right. If there's anything later, just throw in the chat and we'll try.
I had one actually.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I meant to cut in sooner.
Please.
For anybody who's interested in the state of JavaScript survey, I don't know if that's still a reputable survey to go through. I filled it out this morning, but I know they're in their last week of collecting responses for that. So just a heads up there, and we can share that link in the meetup page or in the chat.
Thank you, Sam. With that, let's see if there are any lightning talks. We had one sign up, but people aren't always able to make it. If anyone has signed up or would like to jump up right now, we welcome lightning talks. They don't have to be polished at all. They could be just a quick run through of something you built, or a quick chat about something that you learned recently. Is there anybody that would like to present right now?
I have so many talk ideas that I'd love to present on, but they're just not formulated enough to even give a 2-minute blurb on.
That's good. Well, I'll definitely encourage them next year. We love to have them. It's totally cool we don't have any right now. We will have more in the future. And with that, I am very excited to announce our speaker tonight. Doug Whitney he was a lead developer that I got to work with a while back, and I wish I got to spend more time with him. We get to do that a little bit tonight. I'm very excited to hear about uncontrolled form inputs in React. Definitely mucked with that and here and there, and tripped over a number of things. So I hope that Doug can help level myself and everyone else up when it comes to these things. Doug is fantastic. Please give it up for Doug.
Thanks, Will. And hello, everybody. It's great to be speaking here again. I think this meetup is probably where I gave my first lightning talk, actually, which got me into kind of speaking on a more regular basis. So let's see. Share my screen here. Okay. All good? Cool. So yeah, the topic of my talk tonight is uncontrolled form inputs in React. And the reason that I'm talking about this is because I've had the opportunity lately to work on a pretty large application that involves a lot of forms, like a lot of front-end apps do. And we just ran into some challenges along the way, and at one point decided to explore this kind of alternative to what you normally see in React with controlled inputs, and this is kind of what came out of that. So my name is Doug Whitney. I work for a company based here out of Denver called MetaRouter, and we are what I would call like an event routing and distribution platform. So starting from the basic building blocks of HTML, your native text input is pretty simple. When JavaScript was not as prevalent as it was, in most cases, you didn't care about what a user had entered into the form until they actually submitted it, and then you did something with it on the server side. But of course, that has definitely changed with JavaScript and everything being managed client side. So that brings us to controlled inputs or controlled components in React. So you can think of this component wrapping a native input component, and in order to work with this component and keep state synced with React, we give it an on-change handler, and we also give it a value, and then usually a fallback value in case the value is not defined. So then the alternative is an uncontrolled component. Same idea, where it's backed by a native input, but it does not get an on-change handler or a value. You can still give it a default value. So this username represents a variable somewhere else in the scope of this component. But you can see there's no change handler, and it just looks a lot simpler. And it is not as powerful, just kind of out of the box, as what you get with a controlled component. Another way to think about this is just the props that you can pass if you're using controlled or uncontrolled. So again, with a controlled component, a controlled input component in particular, the on-change handler is required, a value is required. You cannot give it a default value, however. That is only for uncontrolled components. I'm not sure if now that I'm looking at this again, if you can pass an on-change handler to an uncontrolled. So I may have that wrong, but you definitely cannot pass it a value, just the default value prop. And then the React docs just touch on this like very briefly and talk about the fact that it can be very tedious when you're writing code to handle forms, because you have to have a handler for every input, and you have to have a bit of state to track every piece. And then they talk about uncontrolled components as perhaps an alternative to that if you are integrating with a pre-existing code base or something that is working with a non-React library. And then, as I kind of mentioned at the opening, the project that I'm working on is an editor that allows users to take these JSON configs that match a special schema and explodes them out into a form. And the way that that works out, depending on how large the configuration files are, the form that's generated from that can have more than 300 fields pretty easily. And as we built the initial implementation of this, it's a greenfield project and was very alpha, almost a proof of concept at the stage that we first approached it. And then, of course, that suddenly turned into needing to be ready for customer demos and becoming a more full-fledged application. So the kind of initial naive implementation used controlled inputs to build this giant form, and also used context to pass this form state through this very kind of deeply nested tree of subcomponents. And the complexity of the form itself, meant that we couldn't manage this all in a single component. Context was helpful there, but it also created problems because it's a very large form and we have controlled components, which means that every keystroke is triggering an onChange event, and that is updating everything that lives under that form context and re-rendering hundreds of input components. And this completely fell over for large configuration files. So we needed to explore different options, and hopefully something that would work without having to rewrite our entire application at that point. So some of the goals, make sure, yeah, okay. So some of the goals that we could keep it performant for these large forms, use our existing input components as much as possible that we had built for our component library. And then ideally, again, because we had split this large form across many components, we would like to keep the initialization at the component level. So what I mean by that is we don't want to have to set all of the initial values for the form like high up in the tree and then access them down later. We want to do that as close to the actual input components as possible, and hopefully keep the API and the props necessary at the component level simple, and offload some of that complexity that usually comes with managing form state at a granular level. And so, with that in mind, the question then kind of becomes, what is your source of truth for this form data in particular? And I think it is different than a lot of things that we talk about in the DOM, because 99% of the time you don't want the DOM to be your source of truth. You want to manage that in state, in your application state. But when we're talking about forms, you can't really get much closer to what the user is doing than what they have done by interacting with the DOM. And when we looked at the example of the controlled the controlled component, the state is still coming from the DOM. It's coming from the event target value, but it's being pushed into React state on every keystroke. And then again, the question is, how or when does React need to know about state changes? There definitely are cases where you need to know when a value has changed. So a type ahead search, for instance, where you want to narrow down a long list of possible matches. But for a lot of cases, and in our application, the majority of cases, we're really concerned about what is happening on blur for validation, and occasionally on change. But for most cases, we're not that concerned until a blur event fires, and then we run validation and do some other stuff at that point. So that gives us a little bit of freedom in the sense that we don't need to update everything on change. We can be a little bit more selective about it. And where we kind of ended up after many iterations and trying different things out and hitting some dead ends was a solution that we're still building on, that uses uncontrolled inputs for anything that fires a change due to a keystroke, right? So we're talking about text inputs, number, password inputs, as opposed to like a select control that is going to fire its change event when the user makes a selection. So all of our text inputs follow this uncontrolled pattern, and that's combined with a hook that does really all of the heavy lifting, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. So the basic life cycle, this set form state is a function that comes from the hook that I mentioned. It gets bound to the form component on blur, and the form state after the initial render gets populated with any initial values that are passed through either the default value for uncontrolled components or the value for controlled components. And then what happens next is that anytime an input fires a blur event, that gets handled and kind of squashed down into form state and re-rendered in the form. So we'll take a closer look at what that looks like here. So here's our form component. It has an onSubmit handler and an onBlur handler. On our initial render, form state starts out as an empty object. Fields may have initial values, and as I mentioned, they do get pulled into state after the initial render, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. So these are the two events that we're really interested in. When the form gets submitted, it gets handled by this submit handler, which is pretty standard. And then if you notice here, the the form also has an onBlur handler, excuse me, and the form itself, I don't believe has a blur event, but it gets the blur events delegated from the input components. So these input components sitting inside of the form, when they fire their blur events, they don't actually handle it themselves. They just let that event bubble up, and the form is the one that's responsible for handling that. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So in both of these paths, what is happening is that on blur or on submit, the hook then grabs all of the input nodes from the DOM and then validates them, and then takes all of those DOM nodes, the objects representing them, and then reduces them back into a single object that gets passed back to the form. So then looking here at the at the blur path in particular, it follows that path that we just talked about. And then on the next render, if on blur that there are errors, those get added into form state, and that form state object now contains errors. The form re-renders, and those errors are then displayed to the user. The other path here is submitting the form. This is pretty standard. Again, on submit, we get all of the nodes from the DOM, and then validate and reduce that back into the form state object. It doesn't really matter at this point if the user has triggered blur on any of the inputs, because we're on submit, we're starting from scratch and just getting the state of the world from the DOM. And this also ensures that we get values for any fields that have been added after the initial render. So if you have some kind of conditional logic where fields are not present, and then based on some choice, you add new fields into the form, this makes sure that you capture those new fields at the submit event. And then this has the kind of standard logic where, again, it is validating the entire form. And if it's invalid, form state gets passed back up. If it is valid, it returns the form data for further processing. So this is an example of what that looks like. So this object on the top contains our inputs, the error messages when they are in the invalid state, and this form state object is what gets derived from the DOM and then passed back to the form component and all of the input components for re-rendering. And then once everything is successful and these values pass validation, it just gets submitted as key value pairs so that it can be, again, processed further. So again, getting values from uncontrolled inputs is a little different than controlled inputs, because they are not automatically in state via the onChange handler. And a lot of what you will find reading about uncontrolled inputs recommends that you have a ref for every input, right? And that is a variable that contains the current node from that ref. So it gives you another way to keep that that value across renders, but it doesn't really solve the problem for our case, because again, for building a large form, it still leaves you with the problem of having to create a ref for every field, as opposed to a change handler for every field. The other option, and the option that we went with here, was again just grabbing everything from the DOM, and doing that gives us access to all of the attributes on the live DOM nodes, which are useful for some of the work that's done in the form hook. So as I mentioned, there's a first pass where the form renders, and then the initial state is fetched from the DOM just after a set timeout, and that re-renders. So it costs you one render to take this kind of approach to get the initial value from the DOM. And then from there, as we saw in that kind of life cycle diagram, state gets updated on blur, and that gets updated for the entire form. And again, importantly, it helps, adding this on blur ensures that anything that is added after the initial render is also in form state as soon as possible. So you see a lot of stuff that says, you know, don't touch the DOM when you're working with React, and I think it gets overgeneralized. I think you know, what they're really saying is don't mutate the DOM when you're working in React, but it's definitely safe to use native DOM methods to read from the document object model and get these form values. And again, it gives you the native DOM nodes with all of the properties that you would expect from an input. So with all of that in mind, one of the other challenges is validation. We already had a kind of working validation set up in place, but it was helpful that we were able to keep it with this setup. And the main challenge here is that, you know, we wanted the ability to pass in custom error messages and other parameters into these validators, but because we are the validators themselves are passed in as props to the components, they aren't present on the DOM nodes when we grab those nodes from, you know, from the browser. And so we had to come up with a workaround for that. But what this looks like is, excuse me, being able to pass in arguments to these validators, which are just again an array of functions, and then we can also pass in custom error messages if necessary. So in this case, we're validating that the old password is not the same as the value that has been entered for this new password. And I thought I must have missed a slide here. The way the validation works is by when these validators are passed through and the input component is created, it registers the validators in a lookup by the ID attribute, which is a required prop on these components, so that when validation runs, when that onBlur event fires and bubbles up to the form can look at the event target and take its ID and go to that validator lookup and then find these functions and then run them at the appropriate time. So that was how we kind of worked around the fact that we lost access to these validators passed in as props once we started working with DOM nodes. So I've got a couple of examples to share here. So let's start here. So this is your basic login form, and you can see here, using this setup, we get validation on Blur. As soon as you start to type in the field again, it clears the error message. And we can fix this now. This comes up as an error. And because we have multiple validators on these fields, it displays the first failing validator back to the user. And then again, you can see what this form state object looks like that is being used to re-render the form. But importantly, nothing is happening until the Blur event fires, and then you can see a new entry here in the log. And then at that point, once all of the validations have been satisfied, we pass the form data, form data here, the key value pairs back to the submit handler so that that can be sent to an API or whatever needs to be done from that point. So here are two instances of that form that we just looked at, and you can see that this works the same way. Oops, let's see. So that all fails. Works, same behavior there. So again, this is just all using that same setup of setting the entire form state on blur. It leverages the onInput event to check if the current target has an error, and if it does, it clears it. So that event does fire on every keystroke, but it is not expensive because it does not update state unless there is actually an error on that field. And then another example here, similar to what we looked at earlier. So here we're checking that these two fields do not contain the same value. And that again was based on that validation where we passed in the value of one field to the validator as well as the custom error message. And then here's an example of a combination of both controlled and uncontrolled. So in this case, you can imagine that this username field might be making an API call to see if the username is available where this email field does not. So this top field is uncontrolled. You can see there's no state updates happening here. And this one does have an onChange handler attached to it so that we could make that API call. So you can see as I'm typing, it is updating on every keystroke, it's updating state. The other kind of thing that I think is illustrated here is just how often those updates happen. And even in a case like this, especially if you're hitting an API, you probably want to make sure you're not sending an event on every keystroke. But it just demonstrates, again, that even with only selectively using controlled fields and defaulting to uncontrolled fields, that it's still very possible to provide a rich user experience and also simplify the actual implementation of forms. Let me see if I can pull up a good example of what that looks like. So here is the code for the change password form that we just looked at. So you can see some of the pieces that we're taking advantage of here. So we have a hook that takes the form ID. So this form ID is shared between the hook and the form itself, and that is the link that the hook uses to get the nodes from the document get element by ID. And then we have our onSubmit handler. Not sure why I called it that. On input, it again allows this on input event to bubble up from the component. So it checks to see if that event target, if the current input has an error, and clears it if it does. and then on blur, it updates the entire form state. And what's really nice about this is it makes inputs very simple. So if we're not populating something from the database, for instance, we don't even need the default value. We can just leave that off. We access the error message from form state, but everything else is handled for us this way. Yeah. So this definitely takes some of the tedium out of developing large forms in particular, and it is also very performant for large forms. So this is the actual application where all of this work came from, and you can see what we have here. It is kind of this expand and collapse setup, but the form itself right now contains over 300 inputs. So as we're moving through these various sections, excuse me, this is just one gigantic form, and we're hiding and showing various sections of it, but keeping all of those inputs in the DOM so that when we submit it, we can just grab everything and work with it there. So again, just keeping in mind that there are hundreds of inputs in this DOM. Hopefully you can see on the screencast that this is extremely responsive, and that is because it is not updating state until the blur event fires, basically. So that's how we have managed to work with our existing input components for the most part. There were changes, and the result is definitely that our input components and the rest of this implementation, the use form hook, are tightly coupled. But that was definitely worth the trade-off, again, for the fact that being able to implement forms simply and do it on a large scale made it a worthwhile trade-off. So again, although we ended up with components and some related code that are tightly related, it simplified our ability to build forms and manage the validation and still provide a good user experience. And it let us take advantage of context and being able to pass this very large object through many components and not worry about the cost of re-renders. So that was helpful as well. And that is all I have. All of the code for this is up on GitHub if you'd like to check it out. It is still definitely a little bit rough, but you can see all of the working examples that we are looking at here. And that's it. Thank you.
Wow, that was super cool. If anyone has any questions, feel free to speak up or throw them in the chat and I'll ask them for you. I was skeptical at times about uncontrolled inputs. I've done so many controlled inputs and I've run into the issues you mentioned. I'm a bit mind blown about your point on I was like, at one point I was like thinking this is antithetical to the React way. And then you pointed out how that's so overgeneralized and overapplied and misapplied to working with the DOM. That was a big eye opener for me.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely had some of those same thoughts along the way.
A question. great talk, first of all. I really appreciate you running through this. I could see a few places already I could make use of it. What's your process been like sort of for testing this? I know you mentioned you're pulling values off of the DOM, or maybe this isn't something you've had a chance to dive into yet, but are you using something like a JS DOM to kind of mock some of these things out, or what's kind of been the approach?
Yeah, good question. And no, all of our testing has been manual. And then I mentioned that these files that we're working with are built for a particular schema, and so we're building them to deploy to a backend service. And luckily, that backend service gives us a lot of feedback on whether or not the JSON is formed correctly. So we've just been kind of offloading our tests to that service. And luckily the results have been good. It's pretty easy to prove that the JSON comes out correctly since it's just one object.
Cool.
The way you looked up the form by an ID, you were getting the form element, and then you have an array of elements. Is that something, this is sort of a DOM thing, but like, is that something that's just on form inputs or form elements?
Right. So yeah, I think you're asking about, I can step back to the.
Yeah, like as opposed to, like, you can't just pull up a div and get all the inputs in it using dot elements. I'm thinking that's a form thing, right? I didn't have a chance.
Yeah, it's just you get the form node, and then the dot elements property contains all of the select elements, password inputs, the button, just any of the form inputs.
I'd never seen that before. That's cool.
Yeah, I started writing a selector to get everything, and then just found there was an easier way.
So I'm curious, Doug, are you guys still using controlled component or controlled inputs in some parts of the app and uncontrolled in others, or like what's the trade-off like that you're making there, and how ubiquitous is this uncontrolled input in the projects you're working in?
Yeah, almost everything. Again, it's text inputs, right, that would fire on change on a keystroke. So it's everything but select elements, really, in like checkboxes. But everything within our application, so everything from user management and the editor that we were looking at has been switched over to uncontrolled. The only real exceptions are like the case that I mentioned, like where we have a list of things and you're searching for one in that list. So then we have a change handler on that to fire a callback on change.
Interesting. Cool.
Well, thank you very much, Doug. I think we'll wrap it there. Sam, can you pull up the slides? We will have the informal chat post stream, but we'll tidy up. We'll wrap up the formal part of this.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. This was great.
Yeah, nice work.
So cool.
Let's see here. Sorry.
Oh, you're good. I'll just start talking then.
Yeah,
always looking for new speakers. Definitely in 2021. We love new speakers. We're always trying to, like, we're very careful to make sure we don't have the same people back over and over and over again within the same year. So we're always looking for new people. We're always looking for people who are new to speaking. Whether you are you're still a student, or you're just graduating, or you're still learning on your own, that's welcome too. You do not need experience to give a great talk. In fact, you can give an amazing talk being in the weeds, just learning things and sharing things as you learn them. So please, if you would like to learn more, or if you want help and mentorship giving your first talk, reach out to us on Twitter at React Denver, or email. I think I gotta remember. I gotta look up her email, but find Sam or me, or Diana, Graham, and any of the organizers that you may find off our Twitter handle, and we'll do the best to help you. And with that, thank you all for joining. We're gonna shut down the live stream, but we'll keep keep up in the Zoom, and